The most unforgettable words are never shouted. They are whispered when the world is too distracted to listen. Hundreds of guests filled the grand ballroom of the Sinclair Foundation's annual charity gala in downtown Denver. Yet only one quiet moment would become the story people never saw coming. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across polished marble floors while a string quartet played softly beneath the steady murmur of executives, philanthropists, and journalists exchanging practiced smiles. Charlotte Hayes, the Billionaire chief executive officer whose name appeared on magazine covers across America, had just concluded another flawless speech about leadership, opportunity, and investing in future generations. Cameras flashed from every direction. Applause echoed through the elegant hall. Investors waited patiently for a chance to shake her hand. Board members followed only a few steps behind, carefully protecting every minute of her schedule. She thanked the audience with the same graceful smile she had perfected over years of public appearances, but behind her composed expression lived a quiet exhaustion no one ever seemed to notice. As she stepped away from the podium, another executive approached with documents requiring her signature. A television producer reminded her about an interview beginning in 5 minutes. A photographer politely requested one last portrait beside the foundation banner. Charlotte acknowledged each request with professional courtesy, yet her attention drifted towards something completely unexpected near the ballroom entrance. A little girl, no older than 8, laughed as she carefully balanced 2 paper cups of lemonade while a man in a faded denim jacket gently steadied one before it could spill. He thanked the waiter before smiling at the child with a warmth that seemed untouched by ambition or performance. Ethan Walker never noticed the cameras following Charlotte because he had never come for recognition. He had accepted an invitation through the neighborhood literacy program, where he volunteered every Saturday with his daughter, Emma. His only concern that afternoon was making sure Emma enjoyed herself without feeling overwhelmed by a room filled with strangers wearing expensive suits. "Dad," Emma whispered, tugging softly on his sleeve. "Everyone here looks important." Ethan looked around the magnificent ballroom before smiling gently. "Every person is important," he answered. "Some people just forget that when the room becomes too loud." Emma nodded thoughtfully, satisfied by an answer that sounded ordinary, but somehow felt bigger than the question itself. Charlotte unknowingly overheard those words as she passed nearby. They lingered in her thoughts longer than another compliment about quarterly profits ever could. She continued walking toward the exit, believing the afternoon was nearly over. Ethan glanced toward Emma to make sure she was safely beside him before quietly stepping out of the flow of guests to allow Charlotte and her team to pass. Their eyes met for the first time. There was no admiration in his expression, no nervousness, no expectation, only calm respect offered to another human being. Charlotte instinctively slowed her pace. For reasons she could not explain, she felt as though this complete stranger saw past every title she had spent years building. Ethan leaned forward just enough that only she could hear what came next. His voice remained soft, almost lost beneath the distant music and polite applause still echoing through the ballroom. "Do not spend your life searching for people who admire your success," he whispered. "Find the ones who would still save you a seat after all of it was gone." Ethan smiled politely, returned to Emma's side, and quietly walked away without looking back. Charlotte remained completely still. The applause faded. The conversations blurred into silence. Reporters continued calling her name. Her assistant repeated the schedule. Even the elevator doors opened and closed beside her. She heard none of it. Only one sentence remained, quietly echoing inside her heart, refusing to let her take another step. 5 days earlier, long before an elegant ballroom fell silent because of one unexpected sentence, Ethan Walker began another ordinary Tuesday the same way he had started nearly every morning for the past 6 years. His alarm rang at 5:30 in the morning, but he was already awake, listening to the familiar sound of rain tapping softly against the kitchen window of the small 2-bedroom house he rented on a quiet street in Denver. The coffee maker hummed gently while pancake batter rested in a mixing bowl beside fresh strawberries that Emma had insisted they buy at the neighborhood farmer's market over the weekend. There was nothing remarkable about the house. The hardwood floor carried the scratches of everyday life. Family photographs lined one wall instead of expensive artwork. A small bookshelf overflowed with novels borrowed from the public library because Ethan believed stories could teach lessons that money never could. Upstairs, Emma slowly climbed out of bed, her blonde hair still tangled from sleep. She walked into the kitchen wrapped in her favorite blue blanket and smiled the moment she smelled breakfast. "Good morning, Dad," she said with a sleepy voice. Ethan smiled back without turning away from the stove. "Good morning, sunshine. Did you dream about flying again?" Emma nodded while climbing onto her chair. "This time I built an airplane that landed on the moon." Ethan laughed quietly. "Then I guess I should start saving for astronaut school." Emma grinned before taking the stack of napkins and placing them carefully on the table because helping had become her favorite morning responsibility. Breakfast was never rushed inside their home. Ethan believed that 15 peaceful minutes together mattered more than another 15 minutes of sleep. They talked about school projects, library books, the weather, and whether squirrels ever became friends with birds. Simple conversations filled the room with a warmth that could never be purchased. After breakfast, Ethan packed Emma's lunch himself, writing a short note on a folded piece of paper before slipping it into her lunchbox. He did it every school day without exception. Sometimes the note contained a joke. Sometimes it offered encouragement before a spelling test. Today's message simply read, "Kindness is something nobody can ever take away from you." Emma never threw those notes away. She kept every single one inside an old shoebox beneath her bed. After dropping Emma off at elementary school, Ethan drove his aging pickup truck across town to the Community Literacy Center, where he worked as the facilities supervisor. His job rarely attracted attention. He repaired broken shelves, fixed leaking faucets, painted classrooms, replaced light bulbs, and made certain every child walked into a building that felt safe and welcoming. Whenever volunteers thanked him for solving another problem, he answered the same way every time. "If people can focus on learning instead of worrying about broken things, then I have already had a good day." During his lunch break, he often wandered into the reading room instead of eating alone. Children waved excitedly whenever they saw him because they knew he always carried a backpack filled with donated books waiting for someone to discover a new favorite story. Ethan never considered himself extraordinary. He simply believed that every person deserved respect before they earned admiration, and every child deserved hope before they understood disappointment. He had no idea that only a few days later those quiet beliefs would cross paths with a woman whose entire life had been built on success, yet who secretly longed to remember what peace actually felt like. Charlotte Hayes had spent more than a decade proving that discipline could build an empire, but somewhere along the way she had quietly forgotten whether success could also build a life. Every morning began before sunrise inside the top-floor penthouse overlooking downtown Denver, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a city that seemed to move only after she had already finished reviewing financial reports. Her calendar was organized down to 5-minute intervals. Meetings with investors filled the morning. Strategy sessions occupied the afternoon. Charity boards, interviews, and international conference calls stretched well into the evening. Her assistant often joked that the calendar breathed less than most people. Charlotte usually smiled politely, yet even she knew it was not really a joke. The luxury surrounding her had become almost invisible. Original paintings decorated the walls. Fresh flowers arrived every Monday without anyone asking. A private chef prepared balanced meals that often cooled untouched because another meeting always demanded her attention. Her penthouse was quiet enough that she could hear the distant sound of traffic nearly 30 floors below, and sometimes that silence felt louder than an arena filled with applause. One Wednesday morning, while reviewing the final preparation for the Sinclair Foundation Charity Gala, Charlotte noticed a handwritten thank you letter among dozens of sponsorship reports. Unlike the polished proposals surrounding it, the letter was simple, A neighborhood literacy center expressed gratitude for receiving a shipment of children's books funded through the foundation. Attached to the letter was a photograph of smiling volunteers standing beside shelves filled with colorful stories. Charlotte looked at the picture for only a few seconds before sliding it aside to continue reading quarterly performance numbers. She did not recognize one volunteer standing quietly near the back with a toolbox resting beside his feet. Ethan Walker had never expected anyone to notice him in the photograph. Later that afternoon, Charlotte attended another executive meeting where the conversation revolved around market expansion, shareholder confidence, and long-term acquisitions. Every projection looked promising. Every presentation ended with applause. Yet when the meeting concluded, she remained seated while everyone else gathered their tablets and coffee cups. One of the directors paused near the door. "Charlotte, are you coming?" he asked. She looked toward the enormous window overlooking the city before answering with a gentle smile. "I will be there in a minute." The conference room emptied, leaving only the faint hum of the air conditioning. Charlotte walked toward the glass and watched people crossing the sidewalks far below. Hundreds of strangers moved with purpose, carrying grocery bags, pushing strollers, walking dogs, or simply sharing conversations that would never appear in financial reports. She suddenly realized she could not remember the last time she had enjoyed an afternoon without checking the time. Her phone vibrated again. Another reminder, another decision, another responsibility waiting for her signature. She answered every request with her usual confidence, but an unfamiliar question quietly settled into her thoughts. If achievement continued growing year after year, why did fulfillment seem to grow smaller? 2 days later, she approved one final change to the guest list for the charity gala, adding several community organizations that had benefited from the foundation's literacy grants. It seemed like a routine decision that required less than 30 seconds. She never imagined that among those additional invitations was a quiet facilities supervisor bringing his young daughter for an afternoon they would both remember forever, or that one ordinary act of generosity would soon place her face to face with someone who measured success by entirely different standards. The Sinclair Foundation Charity Gala arrived beneath a clear Colorado sky, and by late afternoon the historic hotel overlooking downtown Denver had transformed into a gathering place where polished shoes echoed across marble floors and conversations floated through the air as smoothly as the soft jazz performed near the grand staircase. Volunteers welcomed guests with warm smiles while photographers documented every arrival. Ethan Walker adjusted the collar of his navy sport coat before looking down at Emma, who twirled once in her light blue dress with the kind of excitement that only children could carry without apology. "Do I look fancy enough?" she asked. Ethan smiled and gently brushed a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "You look exactly like yourself," he answered. "That is always enough." Emma slipped her hand into his as they entered the ballroom together, her eyes widening at the sparkling chandeliers and elegant floral arrangements. She had never attended an event quite like this before, yet Ethan quietly reminded her of the same lesson he repeated everywhere they went. Treat every person with kindness. The room may change, but the rule never does. Emma nodded with complete confidence. Across the ballroom, Charlotte Hayes greeted business leaders, community partners, and longtime donors with practiced grace. Every handshake was followed by another introduction. Every conversation returned to expansion plans, educational grants, and future investments. She listened carefully, answered thoughtfully, and smiled sincerely. But beneath her calm professionalism, she felt the familiar weight of endless expectations. As another executive praised the foundation's remarkable achievements, Charlotte's attention drifted toward a small scene unfolding near the refreshment table. Emma had accidentally dropped a folded event program while reaching for a paper cup of lemonade. Before she could pick it up, 2 guests hurried past without noticing. Ethan quietly bent down, retrieved the program, straightened its edges, and handed it back with a warm smile. "Some things deserve to be picked up carefully," he said. Emma looked at the slightly wrinkled paper before asking, "Even if it is just paper?" Ethan nodded. "Especially then." If we only respect expensive things, we forget how to respect people. Charlotte had been only a few feet away when those words reached her. She stopped speaking in the middle of a conversation without realizing it. The executive beside her continued discussing financial forecasts, but she no longer heard the numbers. Her eyes remained fixed on the father and daughter walking slowly toward the children's literacy display at the far end of the ballroom. They never looked toward the cameras. They never searched for important guests. They simply enjoyed being together. A few minutes later, Emma wandered toward a table displaying children's books donated through the foundation. One colorful hardcover slipped from the edge of the display before Charlotte instinctively reached out to catch it. Emma looked up with surprise. "Thank you," she said brightly. Charlotte smiled. "You are very welcome." Ethan walked over a moment later, unaware of whom he was addressing. "I appreciate that," he said sincerely. "She loves books so much that she sometimes forgets the rest of the world exists." Charlotte laughed softly, a genuine laugh that appeared before she had time to measure it. "That sounds like a wonderful problem to have." Ethan returned the smile with quiet ease. There was no hesitation in his voice, no effort to impress, and no sign that he recognized one of the most influential women in the room. To him, she was simply another person showing kindness to his daughter. For the first time in many years, Charlotte experienced something she could not explain. She was not being admired for her accomplishments. She was simply being treated as another human being, and somehow that ordinary moment felt more extraordinary than every standing ovation she had ever received. Charlotte Hayes returned to the main stage only minutes later, but the carefully prepared speech resting on the teleprompter suddenly felt strangely distant. She thanked donors, celebrated new literacy initiatives, and spoke with the same polished confidence that had earned standing ovations across the country. Yet every sentence reminded her of another voice she had heard only moments earlier. It was not louder. It was not more persuasive. It was simply more honest. When the applause finally faded, guests gathered into smaller conversations while servers carried trays of sparkling water and freshly prepared appetizers through the ballroom. Ethan and Emma wandered toward an interactive reading exhibit where children were invited to write their favorite life lessons on colorful paper bookmarks that would later be donated with books to local schools. Emma picked up a blue marker and carefully wrote a single sentence before decorating the edges with tiny stars. Ethan glanced at her work and smiled. "Would you like me to read it?" he asked. Emma nodded proudly. The bookmark read, "The nicest people always make room for someone else." Ethan looked at her with quiet admiration. That is a lesson worth sharing. As Emma skipped toward the display board to hang her bookmark beside dozens of others, Charlotte found herself walking in the same direction without planning to. Her schedule insisted she should already be meeting with investors upstairs, yet something far more important seemed to be unfolding in front of her. She stopped beside the display just as Emma finished pinning the bookmark into place. "That is beautiful," Charlotte said sincerely. Emma looked up and smiled. "My dad says kindness is easier to remember if you write it down." Charlotte glanced toward Ethan, who stood a few steps away watching his daughter with unmistakable pride. "Your father sounds very wise," she said. Emma giggled. "He says he just pays attention." Ethan approached with an apologetic smile. "I hope she is not keeping you from your evening." Charlotte gently shook her head. "Quite the opposite." There was a brief silence between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Around them, conversations continued about investments, acquisitions, and market forecasts, but none of those discussions seemed to belong to the quiet space they now shared. Charlotte studied Ethan for a moment before asking, "Have we met before?" Ethan smiled politely. "I do not think so. You seem surprisingly comfortable in a room like this," she observed. Ethan looked around at the elegant ballroom before answering with complete sincerity. "People sometimes think expensive places require different manners. I have always believed kindness works everywhere." Charlotte lowered her eyes for a brief moment as those words settled gently into her thoughts. She had spent years mastering executive strategy, yet this stranger reduced life to truths so simple they became impossible to argue with. An event coordinator hurried toward Charlotte with visible concern. "Miss Hayes, the board is waiting upstairs." The investor reception is about to begin. Ethan immediately stepped aside. I should let you get back to your evening. Charlotte nodded automatically, but instead of leaving, she hesitated. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Hundreds of important conversations still waited for her, yet none seemed as meaningful as this ordinary exchange beside a table filled with children's books. Ethan noticed Emma studying a display of classic novels and quietly joined her without another word. He never asked Charlotte what she did for a living. He never requested a business card. He never recognized the significance of the attention she received from everyone around her. To him, she remained simply the gracious woman who had caught a falling book and encouraged his daughter. Charlotte watched father and daughter disappear into the crowd together, and for the first time in many years, she found herself hoping that the evening was not ending, but somehow just beginning. Charlotte attended the investor reception exactly as planned, but throughout the evening, she found herself searching the ballroom without admitting it even to herself. Every conversation sounded polished, every presentation appeared flawless, and every promise of future growth earned approving smiles. Yet something essential seemed strangely absent. She listened to discussions about expansion, efficiency, and market confidence, while remembering a father who had measured success by whether his daughter felt safe enough to laugh without hesitation. Long after the final guest departed, Charlotte rode the elevator alone to her office overlooking the sleeping city. The lights of Denver shimmered beneath the night sky, like thousands of quiet stories unfolding at once. She removed her heels, placed the evening schedule on her desk, and noticed a small blue bookmark tucked inside one of the folders she had carried home by mistake. It was the bookmark Emma had written earlier. The simple sentence, "The nicest people always make room for someone else," rested in careful handwriting surrounded by tiny hand-drawn stars. Charlotte traced the edge of the paper with her fingertips and smiled before realizing it had been the first genuine smile she had experienced all day. The following morning, she arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. Her assistant entered with coffee and the day's agenda before noticing Charlotte still looking at the bookmark. "Would you like me to file that with the gala materials?" she asked. Charlotte gently shook her head. "No, leave it here." Her assistant hesitated before saying, "The Community Literacy Center sent another thank you package this morning. It is waiting with the correspondence." Charlotte asked for the envelope immediately. Inside were handwritten letters from children describing their favorite books, photographs from reading programs, and a volunteer roster recognizing everyone who had helped prepare the classrooms for the new semester. Her eyes paused on one familiar name: Ethan Walker, Facilities Supervisor, Volunteer Reading Mentor. There were no titles beyond that. No awards. No list of accomplishments. Just a name quietly surrounded by the gratitude of others. Charlotte found herself reading every letter twice. One child had written, "Mr. Ethan says every book deserves another chance because every person does too." Another thanked him for fixing a broken shelf before story time so the library would feel welcoming again. None of the letters praised extraordinary achievements. They simply described ordinary kindness repeated often enough to change lives. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, looking through the office window as morning sunlight spread across the skyline. She had spent years studying leadership through balance sheets, negotiations, and strategic planning, yet these handwritten pages revealed another kind of influence that could never be measured on a quarterly report. It was built one conversation, one repaired shelf, one encouraging note, and one child at a time. She quietly closed the folder and looked again at Emma's bookmark resting beside it. For reasons she could not fully explain, she no longer wanted to remember Ethan Walker only as the quiet father she had briefly met at a charity gala. She wanted to understand how someone with so little interest and recognition had somehow become the most unforgettable person she had encountered in years, and somewhere across the city, completely unaware that his simple way of living had begun changing the heart of one of the most successful women in America. Ethan packed another lunch for Emma, wrote another small note of encouragement, and stepped into another ordinary day that was about to become anything but ordinary. 3 days later, Charlotte canceled a 30-minute strategy meeting for the first time in years. not because the meeting lacked importance, but because another question refused to leave her mind. She asked her assistant to arrange an unannounced visit to the neighborhood literacy center supported by the Sinclair Foundation. When her assistant suggested informing the staff in advance, Charlotte quietly declined. "If people prepare for my arrival, I will only see what they want me to see," she said. "I would rather see what happens when no one is expecting anything." Shortly after noon, a simple black sedan pulled into the small parking lot outside the brick building where children gathered after school. There were no television cameras, no photographers, and no executives following behind her. Charlotte wore a navy sweater beneath a light wool coat instead of one of her tailored business suits, hoping to blend into the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. As she stepped inside, she was greeted not by polished speeches, but by the cheerful sounds of children laughing, pages turning, and volunteers patiently helping young readers sound out unfamiliar words. The scent of old books mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a small staff kitchen. It felt wonderfully alive. Charlotte quietly thanked the receptionist before asking if she could observe without interrupting anyone. She slowly walked through the reading rooms until she reached the library where several children sat in a circle listening to a volunteer read aloud. Ethan was not reading. Instead, he knelt beside a crooked bookshelf with a screwdriver in one hand, carefully tightening loose hinges while speaking with a little boy who stood nearby, holding several books against his chest. "Will it be fixed today?" the boy asked. Ethan smiled warmly without stopping his work. "Before your next visit." The child looked relieved. "I like this shelf because it has the adventure stories." Ethan finished tightening the last screw before gently placing his hand against the wooden frame to make certain it stood perfectly steady. "Then it deserves to stay strong," he replied. "Good stories need good homes." The little boy smiled and hurried away. Charlotte remained quietly behind another bookshelf, watching a conversation so ordinary that most people would have forgotten it within minutes. She could not. Ethan was never performing kindness for applause. He behaved exactly the same whether someone important was watching or no one was watching at all. A volunteer approached, carrying a box filled with damaged children's books. "I was going to recycle these," she said apologetically. Ethan carefully picked up one worn hardcover with torn pages and examined it for a moment. "Not yet," he answered gently. "A little patience can save more than people expect." He gathered tape, glue, and fresh protective covers before beginning to repair each book one by one with remarkable care. Charlotte found herself remembering another sentence she had read in one of the children's letters. "Every book deserves another chance because every person does too." Suddenly, those words no longer sounded like a clever lesson for children. They sounded like the philosophy by which Ethan quietly lived every single day. Without realizing it, Charlotte smiled as she watched him restore stories that others had already decided were beyond saving. For the first time in many years, she wondered whether the greatest builders were not always the ones who constructed companies, but the ones who patiently rebuilt hope, one quiet act of kindness at a time. Over the following weeks, Charlotte found reasons to visit the literacy center that no longer appeared on any corporate calendar. Sometimes she delivered new collections of children's books. Sometimes she attended reading sessions without introducing herself as the founder of the organization providing the funding. More often than not, she simply observed. Every visit revealed another quiet detail about Ethan Walker that no annual report could ever capture. He remembered every child's name. He noticed when someone looked discouraged before they said a single word. He celebrated small victories with the same sincerity that others reserve for life-changing achievements. One chilly Thursday afternoon, Charlotte arrived just as classes were ending. Parents gathered outside, while children hurried through the front doors, carrying backpacks almost as large as themselves. Emma spotted Charlotte immediately and waved enthusiastically. "You came back," she said with genuine excitement. Charlotte smiled warmly. "I was hoping I might." Ethan walked over carrying a small cardboard box filled with newly repaired books. "Good afternoon," he said. "Thank you for supporting this place." The children notice more than adults realize. Charlotte glanced toward the books in his hands. "And they notice what you do for them." Ethan looked down modestly. Most of what I do is tighten screws and fix broken shelves. Charlotte gently shook her head. I do not think that is all you repair. Ethan laughed softly, unsure how to answer. They began walking slowly across the small courtyard while Emma chased colorful autumn leaves drifting across the sidewalk. The afternoon sun cast long shadows beneath the maple trees, and the crisp air carried the comforting scent of pine and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby neighborhood cafe. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt easy rather than uncomfortable. Charlotte finally asked, "Do you ever wish your life had been different?" Ethan watched Emma laughing in the distance before answering. There are days I miss what I lost, but I have learned not to measure my life by what disappeared. I measure it by what still remains. Charlotte lowered her eyes thoughtfully. That sounds difficult. Ethan nodded. Sometimes it is. But gratitude becomes easier when you stop comparing your story to someone else's. His words settled gently into the afternoon air. Charlotte realized that every meaningful conversation she had shared with him seemed remarkably simple, yet each one quietly challenged beliefs she had carried for years. She had built companies by solving complicated problems, but Ethan approached life by protecting uncomplicated truths. As they reached the parking lot, Charlotte thanked him for the conversation. Ethan smiled with the same calm kindness she had come to expect. I should be thanking you. Without your foundation, these children would have fewer opportunities. Charlotte looked directly at him before answering honestly. I used to believe the foundation was changing their future. Now I think people like you are. Ethan gave a humble smile, clearly uncomfortable receiving praise, then opened the passenger door for Emma before wishing Charlotte a pleasant evening. She watched the old pickup truck disappear down the quiet street until it turned the corner and vanished from sight. For the first time since inheriting one of the largest companies in the country, Charlotte drove back to her office without thinking about market forecasts or board meetings. Instead, she found herself wondering whether true leadership had never been about standing in front of people at all. Perhaps it had always begun by quietly walking beside them. 1 year later, the annual literacy celebration returned to Denver, but the atmosphere felt profoundly different for everyone whose lives had quietly crossed because of one ordinary afternoon. The ballroom was just as elegant, the music just as graceful, and the audience just as generous. Yet Charlotte Hayes no longer measured the evening by the size of donations or the number of influential names seated near the stage. Before the program began, she slipped away from the executives waiting to greet her and walked toward a familiar family standing near the children's book display. Emma, now a little taller and just as full of wonder, smiled the moment she saw Charlotte. "I saved you a seat," she said proudly, pointing toward the front row. Charlotte looked at the empty chair beside Ethan and felt something far more valuable than recognition. She felt welcomed. Ethan smiled with the same quiet warmth that had never changed. "Looks like someone made the seating arrangements before I had a chance." Emma nodded confidently. "Dad says you should always save room for people who make life better." Charlotte looked at Ethan with grateful eyes, remembering the first conversation they had ever shared. Neither of them mentioned titles, success, or accomplishments. Those things no longer seemed important between them. During the evening ceremony, Charlotte stepped onto the stage to deliver her annual remarks. The audience expected another polished speech about growth and philanthropy, but instead she folded the prepared pages, placed them on the podium without reading them, and spoke directly from her heart. "For many years," she began softly, "I believed leadership meant building something large enough for the world to admire. Then I met people who reminded me that the greatest things are often built quietly, one act of kindness at a time. I have learned that children remember encouragement longer than speeches, families remember time more than trophies, and communities become stronger because ordinary people choose to care when no one is watching." The ballroom grew completely still. Every executive, donor, volunteer, teacher, and parent listened without interruption. Charlotte continued with a gentle smile. "A wise father once reminded me not to spend my life searching for people who admired success, but to treasure those who would still save me a seat if everything else disappeared. That simple truth changed more than my work. It changed my heart." She looked toward Ethan and Emma, who sat quietly together without seeking attention. Ethan lowered his eyes with humble gratitude, while Emma smiled as though she had known all along that kindness could travel farther than anyone imagined. When the ceremony ended, guests applauded warmly, but the most meaningful moment happened after the lights began to dim. Charlotte joined Ethan and Emma outside beneath a peaceful Colorado sunset, where the evening air carried the gentle scent of pine and blooming flowers. They walked slowly toward the parking lot, talking about school projects, favorite books, and plans for another community reading day. No cameras followed them. No reporters interrupted them. The city continued moving around them, unaware that the greatest miracle of the past year had never appeared in a headline. A successful woman had rediscovered peace. A devoted father had never compromised his quiet dignity. A little girl had watched two good hearts choose respect before anything else. Sometimes life changes because someone gives you more. Sometimes it changes because someone reminds you that what truly matters has been beside you all along. And in the quiet space between ordinary kindness and extraordinary grace, 3 lives found a place that finally felt like home.